Elected in November of 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt has promised the American people a New Deal. This is the name for his plan to save America. And so when he's inaugurated in March of 1933, he immediately gets into doing that. He did have a plan, and he was ready to try to start implementing it as soon as he got into office. And that's what we're going to discuss today.
This is a day of national consecration, and I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. We face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things.
So the first 100 days of a presidency is often seen as sort of a honeymoon period, a grace period, if you will, where the president is generally allowed by Congress to really try to get his agenda pushed out, put forward. So they'll place a lot of emphasis on getting things done in that first 100 days. And FDR, absolutely a great example of this. His first 100 days, he's going to start pushing for that New Deal legislation that he's promised. The other thing he's going to do is he's doing his best to reassure the American people. And he did that in his inaugural address, which you just watched the very first part of, where he says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he continued that by doing something kind of new. He went on the radio on about a weekly basis, sometimes more often, sometimes a little less, but he went on the radio and he spoke live to the whole country. And that was kind of a first, especially to do it regularly. And the theory was he was sitting next to a fire and having a chat with you. Now, everybody, like people have TVs in their houses today, everybody had at least one radio in the house back then, or almost everybody did. Most people had a radio. And so people would gather around the radio and listen to these short, usually, 10, 15 minutes max, talks that he would have. And he would be like, hello, friends, I would like you to understand today what we've been doing to move things forward, to make your lives better. This is what my administration has done. This is what we're working towards. And he did this regularly throughout his presidencies. And it helped to instill a sense of forward progress. It helped to calm the fears of the people. And that was a big deal. He wasn't wrong when he said that paralyzing fear was one of our big problems as to why things hadn't gotten better from the time of 1929 when everything started to 4 years later in 1933 when he's taking office. Things haven't got much better. One of the things he'll do in his first 100 days is create what's called the Brains Trust, where he has an unofficial group of advisors. These are not cabinet members. And that's important because cabinet members legally have to be approved by the Senate. The Brains Trust, because they're unofficial, don't. They don't have official positions within the government. They don't have charge of a department. Speaking of departments, one of the other new things that FDR will do, he appoints the first woman to be a cabinet member, and he puts Frances Perkins in as the head of labor, and she'll be there for like 20 years. She's there forever and a month. Anyway, so he creates these unofficial advisors. Nowadays, we call them czars. Like we used to have the drug czar and the security czar and the this czar and the that czar. They're not secretaries. They're not in charge of a department, but they do have a function within the government. It's quasi-legal. Uh, Really, they should be the vetted by the Senate, but the fact is that they're simply not. So in the first 100 days, what does he do? Well, he focuses on legislation in four major areas: the financial reform, agricultural reform, industrial reform, and unemployment relief, the areas that seem to need the most help. One of the big problems is that Americans no longer trust banks. And so many of them, including people like my grandmother, aren't depositing money in banks. They have no faith in it. They think if I put my money in this bank, tomorrow it'll be gone and I'll be broke. And so it's such a big deal that it's actually the subject of his very first fireside chat. What they've got to do is restore confidence in the banks. And the first thing they do is they pass the Emergency Banking Act, which closes every bank in the country for about a week. And the banks were not allowed to reopen until they were investigated and proved to be sound. In other words, the government sent around accountants to look at the books in every bank, and they looked at how much they had on hand, how much money they had on hand, how much they had loaned out, who had they loaned it out to, what were their records of getting payment back in, had they been making good, solid loans, were they in good operating condition. And if they weren't, the government wouldn't let them reopen. If they were, the bank examiners allowed them to reopen. Now, did that mean that no more banks failed? No, it doesn't. Banks still fail sometimes. It slows down the bank failure rate. Okay. The next thing they'll do is they'll pass the Glass-Steagall Act, which creates an organization known as the FDIC, the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation. This is an insurance company owned and funded by the government, by the federal government, which promises you that because these banks are in good shape, if something happens, we will insure you, John Q. Public, that your deposit is safe up to $2,500. Now, $2,500 was a lot of money back then. You basically buy a house with that. Not a big one, but you could buy a house with that. And so the idea here is, again, to restore confidence in the banks. Why? They need people depositing money in banks, because if there's no money in the banks, then the banks can't make loans to help restart the economy. So this is very important. The Glass-Steagall Act also requires regular bank examinations of the various financial institutions so that they can guarantee that those insurance deposits are safe. This, by the way, because the FDIC is a federal thing, and it still exists, by the way, the FDIC is still around. They have increased the amount of deposit that is secure. I believe it's $250,000 now dollars. But because it's a federally insured thing, this is why robbing banks is a federal crime, and the FBI gets involved. If it's an FDIC insured bank, the FBI will investigate any robbery of it. This makes robbing banks less likely to be successful. The FBI is quite good at catching bank robbers. And by the way, if you ever bank at a place, and you should see, they prominently display signs saying this bank insured by FDIC. Savings and loans have a similar thing. It's called the FSLIC. If your bank does not have FDIC coverage or FSLIC coverage, you need to find a new bank. The last thing that they're going to do in financial reform right up at the front is they're going to create the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. This also still exists. And the SEC is created to regulate the stock market. And what they want to do is prevent abuses of the stock market, things like insider trading. That's what one of the things they do. They investigate insider trading. They can also, if it seems like there is panic selling going on or over speculation has happened and people are panic selling, or then they can suspend trading. They can stop it. They say, nope, we're done for the day. They can even reset the stock exchange. They can say, you know what? Everybody panicked on Friday. We're closed for the day. On Monday, we're going to start off again. Everybody is back to where they were at the opening of the day on Friday. We're going to go back to Friday. It's like, or Friday morning, it's like Friday day never happened. And we'll start that up again Monday morning. Okay, they can do that. And again, the idea is to help people to feel secure in investing in companies, that they're not just, that the stock market's not going to crash again. And so they feel comfortable investing money, which again allows those companies to then raise the funds they need to keep operating, to keep people working, and to help the economy that way.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking, to talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets to the bank and convert them into cash except at panic prices far below their real value.
Another area that really needed to be looked at and reformed, fixed, taken care of was agriculture. A big portion of the country was still farming, over probably not quite, well, it wasn't quite half anymore, but probably about 40% of Americans made their living through agriculture in one form or another. And so that's a big chunk of the people who need a way to make a living. And so what they pass is the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And the idea is to take care of that problem of overproduction, which we mentioned a couple of times at this point previously. So basically what the government does is they subsidize the farmers. They pay farmers to not grow crops. The problem is those checks that they send are based on acreage owned. Sharecroppers don't own the land. They simply work on it. If the landowner decides it's more profitable to just take the check, then the sharecropper doesn't have a job anymore because they won't let them grow crops. That means the sharecropper is out of work. Often it means they're homeless. So this causes problems for sharecroppers while helping landowners. Now, not everybody was a sharecropper. It helped a lot of people, but it didn't help everybody. It would later be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Another issue that was that there were a lot of farms being foreclosed upon because of low income, and so they passed the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act, and that'll provide $200 million. That's 1933 dollars, $200 million in low interest loans to farmers facing foreclosure. This is very similar to what's going on with the COVID-19 issues, where they are offering some fairly substantial low interest loans to small businesses in particular in order to keep employees being paid. There are some tax incentives for that, and it's essentially a means of enticing the employers to keep people on so that they don't lose everything. It's a similar situation. So while many people are farmers, most people are working class workers. They work in one industry or another. And so that's another area that's going to need to be reformed, to be helped. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, creates an organization under the executive branch known as the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. Not the National Rifle Association, different thing, same initials, different thing totally. Under this, industry leaders would put together and agree on codes or rules for fair competition. So they're not trying to shut everybody down. They're trying to say, okay, you've got 30% of the car tire business in America. You're going to get to do 30% of the manufacturing of that. We need 10,000 tires a week made. Your company gets to make 3,000. So set your employment at that. We're going to control prices. Everybody's going to charge the same price for the same size tires. We're going to set a minimum wage that everybody can afford to pay. And the idea is they'll still have competition, but it'll be controlled. It will help to keep people employed in industry without bankrupting the companies that if the maybe not have enough in sales to support that many people. So this is the basic idea. They made a major publicity campaign. You would see posters like this, NRA member, we do our part, up in the shop's windows and everywhere to promote, yes, we're helping. It was a patriotic duty to pitch in and help with this. So majorly pushed. Unfortunately, a lot of manufacturers dodge the codes. They agree to them and then they cheat. They don't pay the minimum wage they promise to. They don't reduce their employee hours. They don't reduce their production. The idea is to control overproduction and in a controlled manner and help things out that way. It will finally actually be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court as well. Another industrial reform was the Public Works Administration. This is an unemployment relief program masquerading as industrial reform. Basically, what they do is the feds start choking out money to a lot of different places, to the states mainly. And what they do is they use that money to build roads, bridges, dams, parks, post offices, courthouses, schools, all of these firehouses, police stations, all of these sort of public uh, jails, prisons, all of these publicly used facilities, all of these facilities that are for the good of the public and everything. It's the infrastructure we're talking about here to put people to work, and it doesn't just put the laborers, of course, to work. It puts, say you're building a dam. Dams use a whole lot of concrete. Guess what? By doing that, you're putting all of these concrete plant workers to work. They have jobs to provide concrete for the dam, and so on and so on and so on. So it's not just the people actually doing the work, it's all the associated businesses. Plus, if there's a work site, there's a restaurant down from the work site, guess what? They're gonna be getting paid. They may have a few bucks. They may grab a burger down at the diner on their way home or something. So that's the idea of this, is to pump that into the system, put people to work, but also make improvements to the country at the same time. So it's a double-edged kind of thing. And the PWA, as it's known, will last for most of the rest of the Depression. And there were several unemployment relief programs. The first is the FERA, F-E-R-A, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which provides federal money to give directly to the states for relief programs. Basically, this is a we don't want you to starve, have some money kind of situation. The PWA, which we just talked about, is one. The Civil Works Administration, the CWA. This is another civil works construction projects type job, building bridges and roads. It lasted for a shorter period of time than the PWA, but it provided 4 million jobs to Americans in the winter of 33 and 34. Basically, the idea was to get people working right then, so that, and a lot of these jobs were in the South, so they would bring them down to the South to keep them from freezing to death in the North during the winter. It gave them jobs in a place so they could afford a place to stay and food. And the emergency situation was that they didn't want people to die as a result of the winter. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, this was one of Roosevelt's absolute favorites. They did outdoor work. It was mostly young men. It was open, unlike some of these, it was open to African Americans, although they did have segregated units. It was run in a sort of a military fashion. The way it was organized and the way they worked and lived was similar to having been in the military at the time. And that's going to be actually kind of helpful a few years later when World War II kicks off, because a lot of the men that go to serve in World War II had been in the Civilian Conservation Corps or other programs like it, and had a little bit of experience living in that lifestyle. So it wasn't quite as much of a jarring difference. And you can see the poster there, one of the recruiting posters, opportunity for workplace, study, and health. And this was for a program being run in Illinois, but it's the CCC. Mostly young men, again. They were required, if they had family, to send money back home to their families. They were paid a small amount of money, but they were fed, they were clothed, they were given a place to live, and they were given medical care. They had recreational facilities in their camps. They had camps. I mean, they lived in tents and things, or they built themselves cabins. Many of their cabins are now cabins in like national parks. You see little camping areas with cabins. A lot of those cabins were originally built for the CCC and by the CCC. But yeah, they put park benches out. They cut trails in through forests. They cut fire breaks in national forests. They put in roads through national parks and things like that. All sorts of ways of improving the parks and national forest systems. There was a major housing crisis as a result of all the unemployment. 500,000 families, 500,000 families lost their homes. And so they created the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which helps regulate interest rates for mortgage. This organization still exists. FHA still exists, and it still helps people to buy houses. Now, not everybody liked the New Deal. There were plenty of people who didn't. On both the right and the left, both conservatives and liberals had problems with it. From the right, they were accused of being socialists, and their programs would stifle individual initiative. An organization called the American Liberty League was formed. They criticized all the spending and the taxes that were raised to help support that spending. The National Association of Manufacturers used radio and other forms of media, newspapers mainly, but also billboards and things, to pass around an anti-Roosevelt message because they didn't like the NRA and the control that supposedly had over manufacturing. Now, remember, a lot of even the members of the NRA were cheating on it. The Supreme Court, which was a more conservative court, because remember, by 1933, when Roosevelt becomes president, there hasn't been a Democrat or a progressive president since 1921. So it's been 12 years. So there's been 12 years of conservative judges being appointed to the federal courts during this time period, and they dominate the Supreme Court. And so that's actually going to lead to a problem here in a little bit we'll talk about. But they agree that some of these programs are unconstitutional. Schechter Poultry versus the United States and Butler versus the United States are the cases. In Butler versus the U.S., the NRA is declared to be an illegal usage of the powers of the executive branch to legislate interstate commerce, because the Constitution specifically says that is in the power of the national legislature, the Congress. And the AAA, which regulated agriculture, was held by the court to be a local and not interstate matter, and therefore not in the scope of the federal government's power under the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause says that Congress will regulate interstate commerce, and the court says agriculture is not an interstate commerce primarily. So they say it's not within the scope of the federal government's power. It's up to the states to regulate, and so we can't do this. Now, so both of those will be struck down. Roosevelt will respond by attempting to rebuild and do things in slightly different ways in order to continue these programs. Something similar to the AAA has been done. The NRA, however, is pretty much dead in the water. While people on the right thought that the New Deal was going too far, FDR still had critics on the left as well who believed that he wasn't doing enough, wasn't going far enough. One of them said, by the name of Francis Townsend, said that they should give a $200 a month payment to seniors over the age of 60. This idea is going to eventually become Social Security. Another one of his major detractors was a fellow by the name of Huey the Kingfish Long. Long had been governor of Louisiana ran for the Senate and became senator, and would be in the Senate until his death in 1935. But while he was in the Senate in Washington, he also basically still ran Louisiana through the political machine that he had created there. He was crooked as a dog's leg. He was a radical populist who pushed for his own plan after he saw that FDR's plans weren't going to go as far as he thought that they ought to, or at least as far as he said he thought that they ought to help out the little guy. Remember, populism is all about helping the little guy. And so he develops a program known as the Share Our Wealth program, and they have clubs all over the country. This idea is very popular amongst, obviously, the poor. Basically, the idea is we're going to take money away from the rich by taxing the crap out of them, and then we're going to provide more and more and more jobs for the poor. And we're just going to redistribute the wealth, essentially. And so while he had supported FDR in 1932, he became disillusioned after the first 100 days failed to really make a massive impact the way he hoped it would, and so planned to run against FDR for president in 1936. But he was assassinated on the steps of the Baton Rouge, Louisiana state capitol in 1935 by the son-in-law of a political rival who he had just ousted from his job. So that's Huey the Kingfish Long, a very outspoken opponent of Roosevelt's from the left. Radical Union and populist movements all wanted Roosevelt to go further, do more. But Roosevelt was compromising somewhat with the more conservative factors, the old guard Republicans and such, in order to get things through. He knew if he went too far, the Supreme Court would simply stop it. And so while things are attempting to limit the New Deal's scope, the left is pushing for it to go further and further, and FDR is kind of caught in between the two. I often refer to the major New Deal programs as alphabet soup because there's quite a few of them, and they're usually known by their acronyms, very common with government policies and organizations to be known by their acronyms. For example, the FBI or the CIA, even now. So I joke about it being like alphabet soup because there's a whole lot of them. And you'll need to know some of them pretty well. We'll go over them here for just a moment. Now this chart, which I scanned from an old text I once had to teach from, does a pretty good job of breaking down the major New Deal programs. We'll talk about a few of them. We've already covered a few of them. You'll notice that some of them are in red. The red are still in existence. So the Social Security Act is still a thing. It still exists. The FDIC still exists. The SEC still exists, and so on. All right, so most of the relief programs are no longer around. We've already talked about the CCC, again, Roosevelt's favorite, where they worked on the conservation projects. The PWA we've discussed, and the CWA we've discussed. Now, we haven't really talked about the WPA. The WPA is interesting because it provides public works jobs, but it largely aims at helping artists, rather than like construction workers and things. And so you will find that a lot of buildings during this time period, a lot of the public buildings built in the 30s by the PWA and the CWA would be decorated by people working for the WPA. They've got murals, they have inlaid floors, they have decorative carvings on the outside, lots of Art Deco and sort of Federalist looking design features on the outsides of these buildings. So if you look at, and a lot of examples still exist, State Fair, the Texas State Fairgrounds up in Dallas is a great example of it. They were built during the 30s, the buildings there. The City Hall down in Houston, I think the county, no, the federal courthouse was. I think the Galveston federal courthouse was. A lot of post offices that were built back then are still around. Not all of them. A lot of them have been built new or modernized since then, but a lot of the older ones still exist, and they're really good-looking buildings. It's neat. Another thing that WPA artists did was they created a lot of the posters, like the one you will see on the next slide. That was created by a WPA artist. The Emergency Banking Act, we discussed that. That's the one that gave the federal government the power to reorganize and strengthen the banks. The FDIC, you really need to know about the FDIC. You really need to know the SEC. You really need to know the CCC. The PWA and the WPA, the differences between them. The Social Security Act, you definitely want to know that. And the two Recovery Acts mentioned down here, both of which were shot down by the Supreme Court. But it's the AAA and the NRA, which was created by the NIRA. So just look at be sure you're familiar with all of these programs and what they did. While the first New Deal was concentrated on stopping the downward spiral and beginning recovery, the second New Deal, which is going to start about 1935-ish, is about creating a social safety net and promoting social justice. The Wagner Act creates the idea that workers have a right to join unions and that they can't be fired for joining a union. So that's going to protect labor. The Social Security Act is going to provide a financial safety net for retired workers. It's going to provide pensions for them and compensation for unemployed and disabled workers. And the point of that, of course, is that many people who had retired were reliant on a pension that they had already earned from companies that were going under and would no longer be able to pay those pensions. And so it was an immediate problem, but also a future problem, because a lot of companies were starting to end their pension plans. And so what we get is a New Deal liberalism. And it's different from classical liberalism. Classical liberalism was sort of what Jefferson and the Founding Fathers had sort of set up. It's more associated with a limited government and free markets, a laissez-faire economics, and a limited role of government. And nowadays, we call that conservatism. New Deal liberals believe that government should assist the needy and guarantee the basic welfare of citizens. And those are pretty much primary components of modern day liberalism, although there are some other things that are involved now too. Now, neither of those is a bad term. Conservative and liberal, they're just descriptors. They're not insults, folks. Well, let me rephrase. They should not be used as insults. They should be used as descriptors. Okay? It simply describes your basic idea of what your beliefs are. So now we get to the election of 1936. Roosevelt's been in office for 4 years. The New Deal is trucking along. He puts through the Works Progress Administration in 1936. His opponents will claim that FDR is using federal money in these work programs to put 8 million people together to work in order to buy himself 8 million votes. because what FDR is doing is buying 8 million votes. He did. That's all there is to it. It employed 8 million people. And of course, it's again another one of the programs that will put people to work on public infrastructure jobs. The WPA and other jobs programs helped FDR to build a widespread coalition of voters, though. And this is essentially, to a large degree, the modern Democrats' bread and butter as far as getting votes is concerned. They put together organized labor, middle-class families, white immigrants, and Northern blacks. Why not Southern blacks? Well, Southern blacks were being kept from voting largely. As we all know, that was a serious problem in the South during this time. He also got the Southern Democrat votes because, well, the solid South. FDR did virtually nothing to help with race relations or civil rights. He basically stayed well away from that as much as he possibly could. He does a little bit during the war itself, but that's excusable because by Southern leadership because it was to help fight the war, although it wasn't popular. But so the election comes along in 1936. The Republicans put up a sacrificial lamb by the name of Alfred Landon challenges FDR, and he'll lose 523 to 8, winning only the states of Maine and Vermont. This is the biggest percentage, 98.49% of the possible electoral votes went to FDR. This is the biggest percentage anyone has gotten since the adoption of the new ticket system back in 1820. So huge landslide victory for FDR. And he's going to take that and say, I have a mandate. Everybody wants what I'm offering. Because, to be honest, it sure looks like that's true. Now, in his second term of office, Roosevelt's going to face a couple of real problems. One is that he is going to attempt something called the court packing plan. And it's going to bring a lot of negative reaction to him. Basically, the thing is, he's upset that the Supreme Court, which is dominated by older conservative judges that were appointed by Republicans during the 1920s, he says that they're blocking my New Deal programs because, well, they were. And so in reaction to that and their use of their judicial review power to declare New Deal programs unconstitutional, FDR comes up with a plan to appoint a new assistant justice for every judge over the age of 70. That would be 6 justices. So his idea is, I'm going to increase the number of justices from 9 to 15, thereby changing the makeup of the court to where a majority of them would be pro-New Deal. And so it's known as the court packing plan. It's overwhelmingly rejected by both parties. The Republicans and the conservatives reject it because it means that he'll be able to kind of do whatever he wants, because then the New Dealers would be in charge of not just the House of Representatives and the presidency, but also of the courts. But by the left didn't want him to do it. The Democratic Party was opposed to it because they feared that the Republicans would turn around and do the exact same thing later on, thereby redistributing everything in the Republicans' favor later, rather than having it the way it had been. There have been 9 justices since Lincoln's days. The last time they had changed the number of justices was during the Civil War. And so it was pretty well established that it would be 9. Another problem he's got is that in 1937, due to fears of the massive deficit spending and the huge debt that the U.S. government is building up, FDR decides to cut back on spending. And so he cuts back on a lot of the jobs programs. Immediately in 1937, you see a increase in unemployment right back up to 19%. Not quite as bad as the worst years when it was about 25, 26%, but still really pretty bad. This shows that the Depression isn't really over yet. The underlying problems, a lot of them have not been cured yet. It's going to take more time. And so this helps proponents of a concept known as Keynesian economics, which says that government must spend money in a depression to, as they put it, prime the pump and stimulate the economy. They must spend lots of money to encourage people to get out and spend money in the economy to help restart the positive growth cycle rather than continued deterioration in a negative fallout cycle, which is what's going on. Okay, and it's called Keynesian economics because it was proposed by a British economist, sorry about that, named John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s had proposed this concept, and so it was kind of brand new and hot and topical, and so it was very popular, and it remained very popular through the 1960s as the means of dealing with an economic downturn was for the government to spend lots of money. And we're back to political cartoons. We all know how much I like political cartoons. And so these are all about the court packing scheme. To the left, we have qualifying test for Supreme Court jobs. FDR is sitting there saying, okay, are you qualified? And what they're doing is basically all of the are saying yes to whatever FDR wants. In the trash bin, you'll notice the scales of justice and the Constitution. In the center panel, it says, do we want a ventriloquist act in the Supreme Court? Uncle Sam looking very confused by the ventriloquist dummies sitting on FDR's leg, where you traditionally hold those dummies, and they all say, yes, yes, we all vote yes, and they're called the packed court. And the last one says, has even a donkey kicking up a storm, and remember, donkeys are the symbol of the Democrat Party. And you've got FDR sitting there saying, well, all I said was give me 6 more justices, and the dove of peace flying away as everyone kicks up a fuss over his suggestion. So nice, subtle cartoons that I really love. One of the goals of the New Deal was to make the United States more of a people's democracy, more helpful to the people in general. During the New Deal, organized labor is going to see a lot of growth. You'll see union membership increase to be about 23% of all industrial workers. The CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, begins to organize all workers within an industry regardless of skill level. It is, like the AFL, sort of a union of unions, and eventually the two will combine and form the AFL-CIO. Women under the New Deal, they didn't get a lot. They got some. They didn't get a lot. Gender inequities persisted. Often married women couldn't find work or would lose their jobs. My grandmother and grandfather didn't marry for part of the Depression because, at least in the early years of the Depression, because my grandmother, who was a school teacher, would have lost her job had she done so. My other grandparents, my grandmother was a school teacher and her husband was the principal and football coach for the school. And basically the only reason she didn't lose her job was, particularly when she became pregnant with my aunt, was because everybody knew that she was married to the principal, and basically he helped her protect her job. Anyway, but they did get some things. Frances Perkins was the first female cabinet member. She was Secretary of Labor. I mentioned her earlier. Eleanor Roosevelt was FDR's wife. Now, if you didn't know, FDR was pretty much confined to a wheelchair. He could walk a little bit. He suffered from polio. He had contracted it as a young man in his 20s, which left his legs very weak and made it very difficult and painful for him to walk. He was unable to walk without the help of braces and crutches, which he did not like. And so usually he is seen seated, generally speaking, with his legs covered by a blanket. It wasn't because he was cold. It was because his legs were deformed by the disease and how it ravaged him. And so out of politeness to cover that, they covered it. And the press actually was very cooperative with that. It's pretty impressive. It was a different day back then. The press was cooperative with stuff like that. You almost never saw him standing unless he was behind a podium and you couldn't see his legs, and he would be leaning on the podium, not using his crutches, or he would be seated with his lap covered or behind a desk or in a car where you couldn't see his legs inside. And they were very careful with that. But because he had difficulty getting around, one of the things that he did was he used his wife to be sort of an ambassador for him. She went around places where it was difficult for him to go. And so Eleanor Roosevelt became sort of his eyes and ears, and is a much more active first lady than we really had ever had before. Prior to Eleanor, the long and the short of it is, First Lady's job was to make sure that the linens got changed by the staff at the White House and to entertain at government parties. That was about all the First Lady did. So it wasn't a major thing. Nowadays, of course, it's typical for each First Lady to take on some kind of a project. Nancy Reagan was famous for Just Say No. She took on drug use in America. Laura Bush was big on childhood education and literacy. Michelle Obama was big on taking care of your eating habits. And of course, every one of them got ridiculed for whatever it was at various times. There are lots of other examples, but it becomes sort of traditional after Eleanor Roosevelt for the First Lady to take some sort of an active and public role, leading some sort of social change program, social improvement program. So while women were often paid less than men for the same jobs, and while women had difficulty finding jobs sometimes and were excluded from certain New Deal programs, it wasn't all bad for them. They were included in quite a few programs, and of course they had the benefit of the general programs that sort of helped everybody out with the banking and the industrial recovery and agricultural recovery, where it helped to start rebuilding the whole economy. Of course, they would be helped by that as well. As they say, a rising tide raises all boats. Another group that got some assistance, but not much from the New Deal, was African Americans. FDR basically stepped very lightly on race issues because he needed the Solid South's political support. If he wanted to get his legislation passed, if he wanted to get reelected, he needed the Southern Democrat votes. And so he avoided confrontation over issues like how the Southern states under the Jim Crow laws and such would unfairly implement the federal practices, making sure that virtually no money went to African Americans. They did get some aid, however, and because the Republicans really hadn't done anything for them, Southern blacks actually start to vote Democrat, the few that vote. Northern blacks, many of whom did vote, began voting Democrat as well. And that's a first, because remember, it's the Republicans who were the party of Lincoln, and the Democrats who had run the South from time immemorial, basically, who had promoted the continuation of slavery and who had been in favor of all of the Jim Crow laws and such in segregation. So there was not a lot of love for the Democratic Party from African Americans. But the help that they start to receive in a time of desperation does begin to change their attitudes towards it. One example of where the New Deal just totally fails ethnic minorities was again in the concepts of civil rights. And one example of what happens is the Scottsboro Boys. It's a pretty famous case of misjustice, really. What happens is 9 young African American men who ranged from 13 to 20 years old, so these are young men, are accused of raping 2 white women on a train outside of Scottsboro, Alabama, and they get put in the Scottsboro jail, so that's why it's called the Scottsboro Boys, in 1931. They will be tried by an all-white jury. There's no evidence, there's no physical evidence that the women were raped. They were examined by physicians. There's nothing but their word that they were raped. That's it. And yet, all 9 were convicted. 8 of them were sentenced to death. The 13-year-old was not, because he was so young. They'll all do jail time, or in the case of the 13-year-old, he went into a juvenile detention. They all do jail time. Every one of their cases will go on appeal. Most of them will be overturned. All of the death sentences are overturned, but most of their sentences are overturned, and all of them are out of jail, either escaped or paroled, or their convictions turned over by 1946. In 2013, the federal judges will overturn all of their past convictions, and they will be posthumously found not guilty. The last of them passed away of old age in 1989. He actually had a very interesting story. He escaped in 1946 and hid out until 1976. He managed to elude the authorities for 30 years. At that point, the governor of Alabama, a guy by the name of George Wallace, who was not anything like a friend of African Americans, pardoned him, gave him a pardon. And so he came out of hiding and wrote a book about it. And anyway, the AAA does not help African American sharecroppers. Most African Americans in the South, that's how they made their living, was they were sharecropping farmers. And not all sharecroppers were black, but most black farmers were sharecroppers. And that's because, as I mentioned before, the checks were given to the landowners and sharecroppers got put out of work. Indians, however, Native Americans, actually got a better deal for a change. Now, they still weren't doing great and still aren't, but they got better off. A man named John Collier is made the commissioner of the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he gets pushed through the Indian Reorganization Act, sometimes known as the Indian New Deal. This overturns the old Dawes Severalty Act, reverses those assimilation policies, and guarantees religious freedom for most of the Native Americans and a semi-sovereign nation status that still exists, while also guaranteeing their citizenship as U.S. citizens. Out west, how were things going? Well, Mexican Americans benefited from both the WPA and the CCC. While there was definitely discrimination against Hispanics in the western states, which is primarily the only place you would find them, Texas and the border states was about all that you would see them in mostly, and certainly in any significant numbers at the time. They were not nearly as heavily discriminated against as, for example, African Americans or Asians. Most Chinese and other Asians were absolutely excluded from New Deal programs. Remember, this is still at a time when the Chinese Exclusionary Act was enforced, as well as the Gentlemen's Agreement, which restricted Japanese immigration. The West is impacted specifically by an event known as the Dust Bowl, which was caused by years of drought and over farming, where overcultivation affected the farmland, and the topsoil became parched and dried out. And when winds would come along, it literally took the topsoil up and blew it away. And you can see here on the right a dust storm approaching the town of Spearman, Texas on April 14th, 1935. That is a wall of dirt and dust that has just been picked up and is flying in. And you can see multi-story buildings in the foreground ahead of that that are perhaps a quarter, probably not even that tall, of the height of this thing. So assume those are 40 feet tall barns there. They look to be about 4 stories. That's probably 200 or 300 foot high wall of dust blowing into town. And that's just going to coat everything. The picture below is a very famous Depression era photo of a woman. People like her were known as Okies. These are people from the Great Plains. Oklahoma was sort of famous for it, but so they get called Okies, who left their homes in the Great Plains and because of the Dust Bowl and moved west to California, taking basically everything that they had with them, with literally no hope. This is covered in the book and films made of the book of The Grapes of Wrath, for example. But this particular photo was taken by a woman named Dorothea Lang, and she worked for the WPA, and she photographed families fleeing the Dust Bowl. And this woman, she found her car was broken down by the side of the road, and she had her 2 little girls with her. The husband was gone, had just left. And so you get this photo of this woman, and it's very touching. I mean, it's literally a picture of despair. She's just, what am I going to do now? And years later, I know that they caught up with the daughters. They found out who the daughters were, and they Time magazine talked with them, and they said that they had eventually made it out to California and had ended up having decent lives. But at the time, it looked pretty bleak for them. So, the New Deal does not completely overcome the Depression. It simply doesn't. What ends the Depression? World War II. World War II is what kills off the Depression. But it does do a lot of things. It left a legacy of reforms and continuing agencies that endeavored to make society and individuals within it more secure. It helps foster a long-term political realignment in which African Americans begin to support the Democratic Party, and so do working class communities. It gets millions of dollars paid in taxes into Social Security, and we begin to have that as a sort of safety net for the elderly. A third of the population is going to go on some form of government assistance as a result of the New Deal. It's criticized by both right and left, which means it was probably a pretty decently moderate solution. Was it necessary? Something was. A lot of people will say it went too far. A lot of people nowadays believe it went too far. A lot of people nowadays still believe it didn't do enough. I think it was the best that could be hoped for at the time. I think FDR would have liked to have gone further to the left, but realized that he couldn't, that it simply wouldn't happen, it wouldn't work. And so the legacy of the New Deal is that it kept people alive. It kept us going until the Depression would end as a result of the start and continuation of World War II. And that is, my friends, where we're going to end with this chapter. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to me on email or when I'm on Discord at the times I've discussed. In the meantime, we look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye now.